Good afternoon everyone and welcome to another APM webinar. Today we're going to be hearing about how to audit for success. So very much looking forward to that. We're ready to go. So today we're joined by Sarah Short. Sarah is a committee member of the APM Assurance SIG and delighted to welcome you, Sarah, and thank you very much and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you very much for taking the time out. To begin with, probably an introduction to myself. I have a background in change management. I've worked for about 14 years in different change delivery and governance roles. I work in the financial services industry and have worked for different companies, including Lloyds Banking Group and building societies and a few other banks. And for the last 2 years, I've been working in internal audit as a change specialist. And I am also a volunteer, as it says on the screen, as the lead of the project audit workstream in the APM Assurance SIG. So hopefully that's a little bit of an insight into why I am hopefully a good person to help give you a bit of an introduction into project auditing and how you can make the most of this for the success of your project. I'd like to begin by asking you, the question is, what are you hoping to gain from this webinar? And the possible answers were an idea of how to maximize the benefits from project auditing, an understanding of how a project audit is conducted, an understanding of why audits are necessary, and a way to avoid project audits, which I appreciate the honesty of the person who has answered that is their aim for today. Hopefully by the end of today's presentation, that mindset might have changed, but it looks like people are primarily here for a mixture of either an understanding of how a project audit is conducted, or to understand how they can gain most benefit from project audits. That is really brilliant to see. Thank you very much. And I am very glad to see that the number of people trying to avoid project audits has not increased. Okay, so I think that has answered my question. I'll end it there. Okay, so this was just a brief slide to explain the objective of today's webinar from my point of view. This webinar will unfortunately not answer all your questions about project auditing, but I hope that it will provide some useful information and an insight into the purpose and the value of project auditing, and will potentially challenge your perception of project auditing. For anyone seeking more information after today's webinar, you can either contact us at the Assurance SIG. I will provide contact details at the end of the webinar, or there are actually publications that are available on the APM website. As you can see, there's one that is actually titled A Guide to Project Auditing, but closely related are the measures for assuring projects, a guide to assurance of agile delivery, if that's the environment you work in, and a guide to integrated assurance. Some of these are actually due to be updated in the next 6 to 12 months to incorporate guidance around programs and portfolios. So look out for those in the short to medium term. Okay, so let's get into the presentation. What will we be covering today? Well, we're going to cover why do we need assurance? We want to understand the purpose and the value of assurance. We will also look at what is project auditing. This will be a brief look at what auditing is and how it fits into the 3 lines of defense in risk management. And finally, we will look at how we can get the most value from project auditing. This will provide a brief overview of the audit process and what is in it for you. Okay, let's get into it. So why? As Bob here will tell you, we all need assurance from time to time. In project auditing, we need to be reassured that the project is on track, that it will achieve its objectives, and it will deliver safely. Project auditing is designed to provide independent assurance to stakeholders. Obviously, project teams are always very busy planning, building, testing, and delivering. It is very easy for them to miss something or to not recognize the significance of a risk. It is an auditor's job to be a second pair of eyes who can take their time to assess risk, analyse how it is being controlled, and identify areas for improvement. Who is it for? So who is our audit for? Primarily, our stakeholders will be the audit committee and an organisation's board. But the insight provided by the audit team should be of value to all our stakeholders. This would be the project sponsor, who is responsible for the success of the project, senior management, who may own the processes or controls which require improvement, and ultimately anyone who owns or operates a control. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we all want our projects and our organisations to succeed. An internal audit play a key role in supporting that. Okay, let's move on to what. What is project auditing? Forgive the quote, but I'm afraid it was necessary. According to the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, assurance is an independent, objective assurance consulting activity designed to add value and improve an organisation's operations. It helps an organisation to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control and governance processes. You'll see I've highlighted the words independent objective assurance. That's to remind us of the key difference between audit and other assurance teams. First line and second line teams are more at risk of being influenced by senior management. Internal audit have to maintain their independence and must be able to demonstrate this to regulators. I've also highlighted the words to add value and improve to remind us of the positive intention of audit. It does not aim to point out where colleagues and teams are not performing their jobs. It aims to highlight risk to the business. I'm sure we can all think of examples where organisations and their customers have suffered due to organisations' weaknesses and poor risk management. A well-delivered project audit can provide valuable insight and help to protect the goals of the project. Next, a quick look at audit lingo. So obviously, depending upon the organisation and industry you work in, there may be a lot more lingo, but it is useful to know that auditors focus on risk and control. You will all know what we mean by a risk. Put simply, it is the risk of something bad happening. But I wanted to make sure that we had a clear and common understanding of what control is. It is any action taken to manage risk and increase the likelihood that goals will be achieved. In project management, controls are used to manage change risk. This could be a signed off document, such as the business case, where you ask stakeholders to agree to the objective, costs, risks, etc. associated with the project. Or it could be a decision-making forum or a risk register and the processes that sit around it. Hopefully that clarifies why we always talk about risk and control within audit. Next, I wanted to walk through the principles of audit taken from the Guide to Integrated Assurance. This tells us that internal audit should be independent, as mentioned previously. They should not be influenced by senior management and will be answerable only to the audit committee, board and regulators. The audit should form part of the organisation's management system in the annual audit plan. It should be proportionate to risk potential and the assurance needs of our stakeholders. Whilst internal audit must maintain their independence and not be swayed or overly influenced, we should take into account the needs and viewpoints of our stakeholders. Audits should be risk-based against an independent risk evaluation. Auditors will always perform their own risk assessment of a project or a business area in scope of the audit. And finally, audit should enable weaknesses and potential risks to be reported to senior management and addressed. And next, I wanted to take a look at the 3 lines of defence. a common risk management model in organizations today. So forgive me if this is something you already know, but I am often surprised that people, whilst they may have heard of it, do not have a detailed understanding of the 3 lines of defense, and in particular, the role that audit plays. So let's just go through this briefly. The model is designed to ensure effective management of risk. The board provides direction to senior management by setting the organization's risk appetite, and then they delegate ownership and responsibility for operating risk management and control to both the CEO and senior management. To ensure effective control of risk, senior management rely on adequate line functions, including monitoring and assurance functions, hence the 3 lines of defense. First line are the functions that own and manage risk. In project management for change risk, this will be the project team, project management office, and any first line change assurance teams. Second line are the functions that oversee or specialize in risk management. So this will be your enterprise risk management teams or compliance. And the third line of defense is the independent line of internal audit. Their assurance will cover how effectively the organization assesses and manages its risk, and will include assurance on the effectiveness of the first and second lines. Internal audit scope should be unrestricted. Okay, let's move on to the next section, the more detailed one of how. So the final set of questions about your relationship with internal audit. So question number 1, when you were last audited, did you feel that your risks and concerns were taken into account? So we'll give it a couple of minutes. We've had 25 responses so far. So it's looking fairly positive at the moment, which is a very good sign of your internal audit teams and your relationship with them. Okay, I'm going to assume that one is generally positive, but there are quite a few of you who don't really know or feel that they weren't. Do you maintain an effective working relationship with your audit team? So it looks like there's more that do, but there's not that significant a difference really. So I think that's obviously quite a mixed bag. Great. Okay, so that gives me an idea of how you all work with your own internal audit teams. Thank you very much for that. So what I wanted to suggest was that if you have up until now had, you know, a limited or perhaps even a negative relationship with your internal audit team, I was going to suggest, why not flip the script? So instead of viewing assurance negatively, why not welcome it and use it as a tool for yourself, your team, your project? Stop feeling as if assurance is something that is being done to you. And my best advice would be to design an assurance approach for each project that you work on. So at the beginning of the project, carry out a detailed risk assessment and design an appropriate assurance approach. This might be one that would involve only first line if it is a small change or a low risk project. You may decide that first line of defense and your assurance teams may be sufficient. Or if it is a large, high risk change, you may decide that you wish to involve second and third line. Obviously, internal audit may not be able to support your proposal, but they will always appreciate the proactive engagement and the control that you are trying to apply. Another good idea is to obviously maintain a relationship with internal audit, even if your area is not currently in scope of an audit. Personally, as an internal audit manager for our change in IT areas, I hold either monthly or quarterly meetings with my stakeholders in both change and IT. I use it to provide them with updates regarding ongoing audit, but also the future audit plan, and to provide them with an opportunity to raise risks and issues, or even any concerns they have with regard to internal audit. I just think this will help build a more effective working relationship between areas and to ensure that you get the most from your internal audit team. Okay, now I'd like to walk through an audit process. This may differ slightly in different organisations, but this is a fairly standard approach. As you'll see, it is very similar to projects in that it follows a methodology and a life cycle. Let's briefly just walk through each phase. So the first phase, scope and plan. During this phase, an auditor will gather information about the project or the business areas in scope. They will carry out a risk assessment and identify the key risks to be reviewed. They will also build a picture of the controls in scope and develop a high-level plan for the review of these. This will include an assessment of the skills required in audit to perform the audit. For project auditing, it's obviously beneficial if the auditor has some change management experience. And the output of the phase is a terms of reference, which will outline the scope and timescales of the audit. The field work comprises of the next two stages. It is the time spent working with project teams and business teams, and is divided into an assessment of design adequacy of each control and a review of their operational effectiveness. So an example would be a steering group. It's obviously a decision-making forum with an agreed mandate. For design adequacy, we would look at the terms of reference for the forum to understand its purpose. We would review the attendees, the meeting frequency, its inputs and outputs to determine whether we believe it is designed adequately to perform the control as expected. We would then test its operational effectiveness by attending a few meetings, reviewing the information provided, seeing who actually attends, hearing the conversations held, and seeing whether the forum operates as expected and will act as an effective control. Once we have concluded our assessment, any findings should be reviewed with our stakeholders to ensure their factual accuracy. And then an audit report will be produced. The audit report will outline the findings, the impact of those findings, and the root cause. And the purpose of looking at the root cause should be to see, are there any common root causes? Do we see the same things coming up time and time again, especially across different projects? That would then show us that we have a thematic or systemic issue that needs to be addressed. The audit report will be sent to our key stakeholders, senior management, board and audit committee. And depending upon the rating, it may even be sent to a regulator. This is normally only for those that are rated as unsatisfactory, where we've identified major weaknesses in the risk framework. So it's hopefully not very often and not very common. And finally, we will track completion of the actions agreed with senior management, and we will aim to confirm that the weaknesses identified have been addressed. Now, apologies for that detail. Some people don't like to perhaps know that much information, but I imagine what you're asking yourselves is, why is this relevant to you? So if I move on to the next slide, I have tried to actually call out what is in it for you. If you embrace the audit and work collaboratively with the auditor, then you are going to maximise the benefit and value you gain from it. As you can see, you will have the opportunity to have your say and provide input throughout the process. During the planning phase, you have the opportunity to raise any risks you are aware of to ensure they are considered for the scope. You can also have input into the plan. Are there any time periods which should be avoided in order to protect the project? Now, as you can imagine, often the response to that would be, the project is always busy and you should avoid almost all the time. But a project team should really embrace the idea that this is going to provide them benefit, really, and just choose those really peak times of work that might be avoided. During field work, encourage your teams to be open and honest. We're not there to tell them that they are doing anything wrong. And by doing all of this and by supporting the auditor and working collaboratively, the audit should provide useful insight. And by addressing the agreed actions, the risk to the organisation should be reduced. Okay. Briefly, I wanted to explain what might be covered in a project audit. And basically, the answer is anything. Any part of the project which might pose a risk may be in scope of an audit. Also, audits may cover a broad review of the governance controls being applied, or it may focus on one small area, such as testing. It all depends upon the risk assessment carried out at the beginning of the project. Okay, let's move on. So, in this last section, I've chosen to focus on a few areas where we can gain the most value from an audit if performed well. As explained previously, internal audit will always perform their own risk assessment of a project or a business area in scope. This will help define the level of assurance required and the scope of the audit. These are 4 areas which should be considered as part of the risk assessment. They are the level of risk posed by the project, and this should be assessed against your organisation's risk management framework. Which operational risks might be affected by the project or the changes being implemented. They could be IT risk, supply chain, financial crime, information security, or many others. And we should look at which change controls are in scope of the current lifecycle stage. Are you in the early phases where we might want to look at the benefits case, or the benefits register, or the business case? Are you in the design phase where we may want to look at design documentation? Or are you nearer to implementation where we might want to look at the testing performed? And finally, the project's risk register itself. Obviously, the project teams and the subject matter experts feeding into the project will be raising and managing risk as they proceed, so that is a useful source of information. By reviewing these in detail, we can be confident that the audit is focusing on the right areas and reviewing the key risks. Okay, a few other thoughts on how to maximise the benefit from an audit. One is to conduct a risk-based audit. Your auditor should try not to cover everything. Don't review all the controls on a project. Instead, they should focus their efforts. Collaborative planning. So it may remind us a little bit of agile project management, but it is a useful approach. So during the planning phase of an audit, we should get input from our stakeholders. They obviously, as the subject matter experts, are useful. Their knowledge and understanding of the risks are invaluable. And we should focus on key risks first. Again, prioritize your scope. Cover the key risks first in case you run out of time. Audits are like projects that they are generally time boxed. This will ensure the audit provides some value. And why not consider reporting iteratively? Often an audit may take 2 to 3 months, and it is common that people wait until the final audit report to provide their feedback. But why not provide it iteratively, whether in written form or just verbally? That way management can start working to address any weaknesses whilst the audit continues. And discuss your approach with stakeholders throughout the audit process. Obviously, if you keep communication and you keep using the knowledge and understanding of stakeholders, an auditor will get useful insight from that. Okay, and my final piece of advice is regarding the audit report. It should not be underestimated how important it is for an auditor to write a quality report. They want to make sure that their audience will read and understand the report. They need to make it concise and to the point, which may often mean that it is also blunt, but that is the focus of audit, to highlight risk. They should ensure that it provides valuable insight. They should write clear findings that explain the impact and the root cause of their findings. And they need to agree management actions that will actually improve control and reduce risk and will address the identified weaknesses. Okay, I actually got through that in record time. So I think we can open it up to any questions. So Sarah, I think you were going to have a look through and see if anyone was posing a question.
Yeah, hi Sarah, thank you for that. That's really interesting. So lots of tips to take away. But one question that's come up, it's actually about some of the templates you've used, and they've asked with regard to how they can access those. So is there a reference or a source for this audit process template that you've used today?
That is actually taken from my own organisation, but I think what we can do, Roy, are you on? Do any of our publications that you will know in a lot more detail than myself actually outline the audit process? If not, it may be something to consider for our refresh of the project auditing guide. Roy is the chair of the Assurance SIG, so he's obviously been on the Assurance SIG a lot longer than myself and knows the publications better.
I think in specific answer to that question, then no. However, the existing guide to project auditing does sort of take you through how to plan and how to execute an audit. I don't think it's anything quite like the lifecycle thing that you showed there within it.
I think it is something for us to take away though, so thank you to have prompted that, because I think visual aids are very useful, especially in publications. So I think during our work to refresh the guide over the next 6 to 12 months, we will take that into consideration.
Great, thank you for that. A couple of other questions that we've got here posed already is how important is the choice of auditor?
I would say it's fairly important. So they do need to have the required skills to conduct an audit. They don't necessarily have to have an in-depth knowledge of change management if it is a change management audit, because they are trained and skilled to look at a process, whatever that process may be, to ensure they understand it well enough that they understand the purpose of the process, the risk that might be associated, and the controls that are put in place and how they should operate. They will use subject matter experts, so the project team, to understand that, and they are particularly skilled at looking at risk and control. However, having said that, I know that my organisation, after recruiting myself as a change specialist, has found benefit from that. I think I and my experience provide valuable insight, and potentially I can get to the nub of the issue a little bit more quickly, and it is very appreciated, I believe, by my stakeholders that I have that background and that experience. But it does not mean to say that an audit carried out by someone without the same experience as me will not do a valuable job. It's probably a bit of a bland answer, but that's the one I have. Thanks, Sarah.
That's great, thank you. Going on to our next question. How do we organise an independent company audit for a project?
An independent? Sure.
Sorry, without upsetting the project leaders.
Oh, right. Okay. Again, it is about that relationship with internal audit, I think. I think if your project team, not just the senior managers, but the entire project team, come to see internal audit not as, you know, the scary tax auditors or something similar, but that they are an integral part of the organisation and the project team as a wider point, it should not be offensive or upsetting. I do know that when I joined my organisation, I did even used to joke that it was like coming in as Darth Vader, that people were dreading the auditor. But I do believe by the approach that I've taken to try and build effective working relationships, maintaining those, as I said, with regular meetings with my primary stakeholders, people are a lot more comfortable when I come along, and I do try to explain that I'm not there to tell them that they are doing anything wrong or they're doing a bad job. It is for me to highlight to them opportunities for them to improve and for us all to improve. So I think a lot of it is about the relationship and the perception of internal audit, and as anyone, as a senior manager, you can help influence that.
Great, thank you. It so often does rely and come down to some relationships, doesn't it, in these things? Another question, it's not quite finished, I don't think, so I don't know if Elizabeth, you're online and you can finish off your question for me in the chat box, but please provide examples of the type of projects you audit, size, type, and how, and that's how the question ends. So I'm not sure what the end of that question was, but some examples of the sort of projects that you've audited.
Sure, okay. So in the organisation I work for, which is a building society at the moment, I have conducted audits on projects which have, so my first one was on a project where we were asking a third-party supplier to build a piece of technology that would integrate with our own, and they would carry out some of the customer service process for our customers, and there would obviously be handoffs of information and data and the customers themselves. So I performed an audit twice on that project, once in its earlier stages to identify whether it was set up for success, was the right governance approach being used, had it been set up at the right level of the hierarchy, as in, was it just a project? And actually no, it was a program with several projects below. Was it in control of its third-party suppliers? And it turned out there were 13 third-party suppliers and 13 contacts or account directors, whatever you might call them, within our organisation, which was very complex. So we actually identified the need for a single commercial lead to be assigned to the project throughout its life cycle to help it succeed and to coordinate the different suppliers. I also did one on the same project when it was due to deliver. So I did an assessment of its readiness, and it was great to actually conduct an audit that came out with a green satisfactory rating. They were well prepared for their delivery. I've also conducted an ongoing review that I'm doing at the moment of our organisation's digital transformation. So as a building society, we're perhaps a little bit behind the curve of banks in terms of online banking, mobile applications and the likes of, and also agile delivery. So I am conducting a series of audits looking at different areas of such a large transformation, which is a portfolio in its own. I'm choosing which areas I see risk in. I've looked at how we are delivering an agile project as people who are new to that. I'm looking at how we are launching new channels, such as a mobile application. So I'm working constantly with senior management and directors to see where they see risk, where they want assurance on such a significant change for our organisation. But I could also cover, we also provide some assurance of smaller change, but they would be a thematic review. So you can often either have a single project being audited, or you could say, I will look at a phase of the life cycle or a certain set of controls. So I have conducted an audit of change initiation. So how do we, as an organisation, identify the need for change, assess the need, approve it, and then how do we get started, get down the right route to deliver that change? So that was more of a thematic review. Yeah. And I would have sampled several changes in that. Sorry, a long answer with that one, Sarah.
No, that's fine. And it kind of rolls into the end of the question that was missing initially. And so really, talking about the projects you've done, the question that's still posing is, how you typically take your recommendations forward to the management?
So that is through the audit report. I do generally run my audits as if they were a project. I can't get away from being a project manager. But after I've spent time with the different teams, assessing their risks, having a look at their controls, if I identify a few areas where we can improve, it would be a matter as if you were to get together a project team. So I get together all those stakeholders that I've spoken to. I will have templated up the findings that I have identified. I will probably have drafted some suggested actions, and as a team we should walk through those. And I am not so much asking for a lot of input, but I am asking for confirmation of the factual accuracy of my findings. Obviously, people are normally wary to receive constructive feedback, especially from audit. So we can't invite too much challenge, but if we're not accurate, we need to be told, and we need to revisit what we found. But it's through collaboration and discussion and presentation in that sort of format that I will present it back to the stakeholders. Once it's been agreed by detailed stakeholders, I then present it to relevant executives, chiefs and directors, whoever need to be ultimately responsible for addressing the weaknesses and the improvements, and I will get them to agree dates for completing the actions that we've discussed. Hopefully that answers the question, Elizabeth.
They've heard what you said about being an auditor, and they think it sounds great. And how do I become an auditor?
Oh, right, great. I think I had an unusual route into it, to be honest. I just saw a job advertised for internal audit in Change, and I think my organisation is quite unique in trying to embrace that as a skill set, but I think it is one that is becoming more common. I do believe most organisations do offer junior audit roles if it's something that you're inexperienced in, so that might be either internal audit manager or just an auditor that you can apply for. But I would say that if you're in a company where you are interested in doing a sideward step or a step into audit, it might be worth just contacting them and asking about any opportunities, whether they see value in the skill set that you have. But otherwise, it's just probably looking out as you would for any other job on LinkedIn or any other provider of recruitment to see if there is an internal audit manager role going. And I think don't discount yourself just because you may not have that background, because it is a discipline and a process, but it is one that you can learn. And if you have other skills that they need, as in the areas that you will audit, that is just as valuable.
Great, thank you. Lots of tips there. Some tips that might have already been picked up in your previous responses, but one question has been posed. I work for a very small organisation, so my difficulties are being able to engage sufficiently with the director, and he is extremely busy. Any tips?
Is that the direct? I'm assuming that's going to be the director of audit.
It doesn't actually say, but if Deborah, if you're able to sort of provide a little bit more clarity on that, then we can come back to that, shall we? Should we come back to that one?
Yeah, because I think it would be a very different answer if it wasn't audit.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is, should an audit be able to stop a project?
The audit team would not be the ones to make the final decision about stopping an audit. We may highlight the risks associated with continuing, and we may agree an action with the relevant director or executives that something needs to be put in place before it can continue. So I did actually find myself at the end of last year on an audit of a project where they were due to deliver a change, and I highlighted that they did not have an appropriate support model for the change in the service when it was going to go live. So an agreed action with the relevant senior management was that they would define and implement the support model before that change went live, and they delayed implementation for 6 months. So it was good that our executive agreed to that reasonably comfortably, If they didn't, I suppose the audit report would have been issued anyway with that as a suggested action, or at least that it needs to be reviewed. So I think we have the influence with board and audit committee that they should listen. But I do know, and I've heard horror stories, that organisations often haven't listened to audit and things have gone wrong. So I don't think we necessarily have the power, we just have the influence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, very helpful. Deborah has come back and elaborated on her question with regard to the small company. So it is the director of the company that she's referring to, and they only have 4 permanent staff in situ in this organisation.
Right. So you're more calling out that if you cannot get time with the director to discuss whatever you need to discuss, it poses a risk. If it is something that you feel is a risk and you've gone through every method of communication that you feel is standard and appropriate, if you do have an internal audit team and you really do feel there is a risk that needs highlighting, you can proactively contact them. They do not have to be conducting an audit in your area. If there is a risk to the business, they are an escalation route and a conduit to highlight that to the business, and they, as I say, have a lot of influence, so can be used as a tool for that. They obviously will need to agree with the level of risk before they would escalate anything, but if they do, they are useful for that. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you, Sarah, for elaborating on that. Next question. Apologies for the simplistic question. I'm sure I won't find it simplistic, but apologies for the simplistic question. But to help make my learning actionable, in a nutshell, what are the top 3 to 5 things you would be looking for when you audit a project?
Okay, challenge. So, not a simplistic question, don't worry. So if actually, what might be useful to you for additional reading would be the measures for assuring projects. In there, they have the 10 criteria that we agreed between that work stream and ours as the criteria that we would use to assess a project. They are in an order as of today that perhaps I wouldn't personally say is in priority order. I think we've agreed that for the refresh we're going to rejig the order, because I would always put as number 1 is governance. So you need to have an appropriate governance structure for both your organisation and your project for it to be a success, I believe, and that is always the primary for me. I'm trying to remember what the other 4 or 5 are. I don't have it in front of me. So I suppose I would say governance, capability. So an organisation's capability, it's not worth having a project team if you don't have the right capabilities and skills within that project team to be a success. So you need to recognise and outline what roles and responsibilities there are, and do you have the right people to fulfil them. Planning, again, very key. That would always be an early one that I would look at. Do you have a plan? Is it sufficiently detailed? Is it communicated? And is it tracked? And do you understand your critical path? So if you do not understand your critical path, you may end up in a situation further down the line of the project that you're running out of time and you're still trying to deliver some of the activities that perhaps could be left until after implementation as a day 2 or day 3 drop. So what was that? Governance, planning, capability, risk and issue management. Obviously, I have to say that. So risk and issue management process has to be effective, has to include all stakeholders, and has to report effectively upwards. So you have to make sure senior management are aware of your risks and issues. So reporting goes in with that. I have seen quite often that projects report themselves as green with no key risks until suddenly they are red, they are late, and they are going to cost a lot more money. A RAG status and a status report and your risks and issues and your plan should all be used as communication tools to say when you are having some difficulty. Senior management can help set direction, set priority. So if your project team is inundated with work and cannot deliver everything, you should turn to your senior management to set direction and prioritize your work to say, if you still want to deliver by the agreed date, we can't deliver the full scope. What is your priority? Or option 2, we deliver late and for more cost, but it should be up to them to decide. I think they would be some of my key ones, but I would really recommend reading those publications, both the project auditing one and the measures. I think that will help with your question.
Great, thank you. That's a really thorough response, so thank you for that. Another question here we have is, how often should projects be audited?
So that is a difficult question because it all depends. So in my own organisation, if we were to count the volume of change, all change we perhaps have 100 to 150 changes underway at the same time, but a lot of those are small change. It may be change that affects only one part of the business, does not affect our customers, does not pose a large financial risk, does not pose a regulatory risk. So if it is a small change with a small impact and small risk associated, we may never look at the individual changes. We may just look at the processes that are used to deliver the change, so more of a thematic review. If it is a large change that comes with a lot of risk to both the organisation, to our customers, of financial risk and reputational risk. If it is being run for only 6 months, you may only be able to fit in one audit because, as I said, they can take a couple of months to complete. If it is running for 2 or 3 years, and therefore the people operating and delivering the project will change, the organisation will change, the external environment will. If it runs for that long, it might be worth conducting several audits. But again, it all comes down to the risk assessment of a project. And I know that our company is really trying to instill that at the beginning stages of a project, the project team and the PMO team undertake quite a detailed assessment of the risk themselves, and they decide whether they would want only the first line teams involved in the assurance, or whether they might even prompt second and third line to get involved. Again, they may not have the time, or they may not agree with the level of risk, but at least it is then in your hands and in your control to suggest it.
Great, thank you, Sarah. A couple more questions, and I think we've got time to cover them. So this question is coming from someone who also works in a small organisation, and that has minimal project management processes in place and no specifications around audits. What are your thoughts on external audit companies undertaking audits, acknowledging that you don't know the company? Or is it best to push for a part-time resource internally to be made available? If the latter, how is it best to convince the board to make the resource available?
Again, as you say, without knowing the company, it is very difficult. I do think there is always value to gain from an internal audit team or individual, as you may say. They will get to know the business, they will get to know the controls. So say they were responsible for change risk and say IT risk, because they go hand in hand quite often. They will get to know the controls in place in the business, and they will be able to help mature them and to make them more effective. So even if they're in place for a fixed term contract, say for a year or 2 years, they can really help to increase the risk management processes and the controls, and may even be able to help influence the need for project management processes. If your business is delivering change, and if it has suffered from change not being delivered effectively, if it has taken longer than it should have, if it has cost more money than it should have, then ultimately there should be an argument for paying for an internal audit resource. However, we do, as our company does use external audit. I mean, they even come in and do an audit of our audit team, which is always interesting. But we do use external audit for skills and experience that we do not have. So often you will have the need for an audit that doesn't come up very often, but so is not a skill set that we will have on hand permanently. So we do need to go externally. They do a very good job. You sometimes have to keep in mind that they're also sometimes trying to get themselves more work. It's rare that I've seen that and that it's swayed any of their results, but you do often have them delivering findings and then saying, and we can help you with this if you employ us for a bit longer. But external auditors have the same skill set that any internal audit would. They cost a lot more money, but if you only need them for a short period and don't need them permanently, they are a useful resource. So again, sorry, a very long-winded answer, but no, I think it really depends on your organisation and your need.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. Right, we've got 3 minutes or so left. So one question which is about what you use, I think, Sarah. So what types of software systems do you use to support your auditing?
So we actually have a system, well, we've just switched from one to another. So there are systems developed for risk management professionals. I don't think it's wrong for me to name ours. Ours is called Magique. It is used by our second line and third line team, which is very useful actually, because we maintain assessments of the different entities. So this is the different teams within our organisation at senior manager level. So the project delivery team, the project management office, they will be separate entities. And we maintain a risk assessment of that area, and we update it regularly, and so do second line, so we get to share information. But what ends up being stored on that system is an outline of what risks and controls we reviewed, what assessment and testing we delivered, what conclusion we reached based on what information. So was it interviews, was it documentation reviews, and we have to store examples of all those on the file, and then the final audit report along with the actions, which are then tracked through to closure. So you end up with one file per audit, which can be handed to a regulator if required, for them to trace back the audit from planning through to closure, for them to hopefully assess that we have reached the correct conclusion. I do know of teams that don't use an online system. They just use Word documents, Excel documents, and save them on their shared drives. But I do recommend that you use a particularly tailored system. It is very useful, makes work a bit more efficient, and is very useful if you ever need to provide that evidence.
Great, thank you. I think you sort of touched this on one of your other responses, in the sense that you mentioned auditors being audited, and that is one question. Who audits the auditors?
External audit. So I believe we have them performed every 2 years. It's an external quality assessment. So they will sample some of our audits to ensure they would have reached the same conclusion. And they also look at the audit team, the methodology we follow, the ways of working, the skill sets and capability, and they will always undoubtedly find an area that we can improve. And they're even quite creative with their suggestions. So one suggestion from our last EQA, external quality assessment, was that we might look into crafting a particular change management methodology, because obviously audit is obviously done of quite stable standard processes, whereas change management obviously by its nature is ever changing. So we have tweaked and come up with a very specific methodology for change management, which doesn't change those phases. It just accepts that a business case may always be a business case. So why would you look at the design of a business case every audit you do? Instead, we should look at more of how effective it is, how that project has used that business case, rather than always going back and looking at the same template and saying, is it designed well? So that's EQAs, but also as an internal audit manager, I have a senior audit manager who will do sample reviews. So they do 3 a quarter. Be hot reviews, which means during our review, and some will be cold, which is afterwards, to tell us whether they agreed with our conclusion. And it has been known that on a cold review, so we have completed the audit, we have sent out our audit report, people working on the actions, and a senior audit manager has done a code review and disagreed with a finding, and we have had to retract the audit report, redo some of the field work, and reissue an audit report. So we are also held to account. We also recognise we are not perfect, and we'll always be able to improve. And I think that those 2 levels of QA of our own work ensure that we constantly improve ourselves.
Yeah, great. So there's a constant reassurance of review process in place. So that's from what I'm hearing, and that's obviously something that you do, and I think everyone probably does as well. Conscious of the time, we're just 2 minutes over. There is just one question left, so those that are still able to stay with us, then please do, and thank you for that. I hope it's not too long a response for you, Sarah. But the last question that we have is, what's the difference between internal audit and quality audit? Do we need both?
Internal audit and quality audit, there should be no difference. So I think quality audit, quality assurance is just a form of assurance. So the same that you get first line, second line, third line, they are all assurance providers. Audit are simply an independent assurance lens. So, and we look at quality as part of our audits. It is an element of a project, as well as control over delivery and governance. Quality is very key. So no, there should be no difference. It is probably just terminology. Great,
that's a super quick answer, and I wasn't expecting it. I thought it would be a long one for you. So that's all our questions. It's been a really interesting hour. Thank you for your time and all the responses to the questions.
Over the very last slide, which just says if anyone has any more questions you think of later, or if they're too detailed to go into now, I have put the email address for the Assurance SIG and our website on the final slide. So please do feel free to contact us. Always happy to impart our knowledge if we can be of help. But also, we're very interested in setting up a user group for project auditing. So if anyone would be interested in participating in a user group, please do send us your contact details. We would use that to raise discussions, cover subject matters around assurance that everyone is interested in. But we're really keen to get that kicked off, and we'll be putting up onto the APM hub as well to try and drum up some interest.
Yeah, brilliant. No, great opportunity to share that, and hope you get some interest, and it's a really great opportunity to engage with people, like-minded people, on the subject. So thank you. That's all from us today. Thank you all very much for attending, and particularly you, Sarah, for sharing your knowledge with everyone, and we look forward to you joining our next webinar soon. Thank you.